Good afternoon, everybody. This is Michael Munson with Forge, and I'm here today with two wonderful people, Eli Green, who's our guest presenter today, and Lori Cook-Daniels, who's going to mostly be behind the scenes today, handling some questions in the question area, which we'll talk about in a second, and helping us field questions. We're really pleased that you're all here, and we're ready to go with a full 90 minutes of information and questions. So some of you I know have been on our webinars before or in our in-person workshops and have seen this slide, and it's something that it's really important for us to always remind folks to take care of themselves. So I don't think anything in this webinar is going to be particularly sensitive to people, but if it is and you need to step out, please know that you'll receive the PowerPoints by email tomorrow, and you'll also be able to access the archived recording so you can listen to it again later whenever you feel more up to it. So please do take care of yourselves in whatever ways that you need to. We won't have a whole lot of interacting today, but let me just show you a couple of ways around the webinar platform in case if you do want to participate interactively. The first way is through the question box, and I see that some of you have already found where that question box is, and I'm wondering if people could just type in their preferred gender pronoun in that question box. So it should probably be at the right side of your screen. And great, I'm seeing a lot of people typing in pronouns. Perfect. Thank you. So that is the area where if you have a question, I know I just saw somebody said that the volume wasn't very high, so I encourage you to adjust the volume on your level, and I will try to speak loudly, which I don't often do. And it's also the area to ask questions when we get to the Q&A section at the end. The other webinar feature that I'd like to point out is the raise hands feature, which we probably won't be doing today, but we may feel spontaneously inclined to do so. And so the little picture on your screen right now shows a hand, and that is where you can raise your hands. So before we get into the content of today's webinar, which is really going to be focused on sexuality and trauma, what I'd like to do is just to offer you a little bit about what we can offer you as service providers and what we can offer your transgender survivor clients. So really briefly, we are a training and technical systems provider through the Office on Violence Against Women. And four of the primary ways that we can support you is through, the first is through one-on-one support. So if you email us or call us or get in touch with us in any way, we will try to help you work through any challenge you have or any difficulties you have working with a trans client or just any questions that you might have around working with trans survivors. The second thing that we can offer you are these monthly webinars. So there's a unique webinar every month focused on different topics. All of them are archived, so you can listen to them later. You can share them at staff meetings. You can do lots of different things with them. And we found that they're a good educational tool, both live as well as in an archived sort of way for people. The third way is through training. So we do a bunch of trainings throughout the country at conferences or through being invited to come and speak or train. So we're always open to those possibilities whenever they arise. And the fourth way is through publications, which we have all freely available on our website. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, to look around and see what might be useful to you and your clients. That's on our website. How we can support you and supporting your clients, or how your clients may want to access services of Forge, we've got four primary ways that I'll share with you today. One is through a listserv, and sometimes survivors really need to be able to talk to somebody or reach out to somebody 24 hours a day, and listservs are great ways where people can fairly safely and from anywhere in the country reach out to other survivors. So that's one possibility. The second is that we have a fairly large referral database, so we can help you or your clients get in touch with local LGBT anti-violence projects. We can help them get connected to therapists in their area that might be trans-savvy or trauma-savvy, hopefully both of those two things. So we have referrals that we can hopefully find for your clients that will be useful to their healing process. The third thing is that we offer an online Writing to Heal course, and one of the really great things about it is that a lot of times trans survivors don't get the help that they need in their communities because a lot of times services are sex segregated and they're not eligible or they're denied access to those healing services. So the Writing to Heal course online allows anybody from any part of the country to participate in a very trauma-informed healing environment with other trans and gender nonconforming and loved ones to create a better environment for their own emotional life and their own healing process. So we just finished with 3 courses, and we'll be starting another one up in the spring. And the fourth way is a really interesting new project that is called the Espavo Project. It combines empowering survivors to have their image taken, the photo taken, and then pairing that with an empowering statement or phrase around resilience. And you'll see some of those slides in today's webinar. So that's the thumbnail sketch of what we can offer you as service providers and what we can offer your clients. We are always grateful for the Office on Violence Against Women who support these monthly webinars, as well as a lot of the other work that we do. So let me just briefly tell you a little bit who's on this call and who's doing what today. So Eli Green will be our guest speaker and will take most of the floor today. He is a really amazing person, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to actually work with him. I don't know that we've ever done direct work together, so it's very exciting. And you will find him to be very engaging and fun to listen to. I'll be doing some of the trauma pieces of it. Eli will do more of the sexuality part, and I'll talk a little bit about how that impacts victim service providers. And then Laurie, Forge's other staff, will be mostly background today, answering questions if you have technical questions, or helping us screen those questions at the end of the webinar when we do Q&A. So feel free to send her questions in the question box at any point in time. So let me briefly go over the agenda for today. Eli is going to talk a little bit about clarifying language. And then Eli and I we'll go back and forth between 4 components of sexuality. These are by no means comprehensive 4 components, but we'll talk about identity and relationships and sexual behavior and sexual health. Then I'll talk just a little bit about some provider implications that didn't come up in those other sections, and then we'll open up for question and answer. So there are 2 caveats that I'd like to add before we jump in. The first is that one of the things that we find is that there's so many different kinds of providers that join our webinars, which we're really grateful for, that there's such a diversity in who attends. But sometimes what that means is that we need to heavily focus on some of the 101 concepts, and that's going to be true today, where it's not always true in some of our other webinars. So what you'll hear today a lot is a lot about transgender sexuality in kind of a 101 format. And then we'll try to add some trauma pieces that relate to those so that it can kind of enhance your knowledge in a more complete way. And then at the end, we'll have questions. So if you do have more advanced questions that we didn't cover, hopefully we can address them at the end. The other caveat is that you will be seeing a lot of images in this PowerPoint presentation. And this is one of the Espavo pictures, like I mentioned, and I love all of the photos that we have of the Espavo project. And what I want you to know is that we definitely get permission to use these photos, and we feel it's really important to have transgender people and transgender survivors in particular represented, so they have literally a face that we can relate to and kind of a personhood that we can relate to. We oftentimes hear that people don't know who trans people are or what trans people look like, and trans people look like everybody else. So hopefully you will find these images to be very warm and personable and relatable. The other caveat with this is that, of course, not every picture that you're going to see is going to include solely a trans person or solely a survivor, so please don't make assumptions, but the majority of the pictures are of trans survivors. So I'm really happy to be able to turn things over to Eli next, who's going to take us through the next section.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much for everybody for joining us today. To start us off, one of the things that we would like to do is we want to clarify the language that we're going to be using throughout the webinar. One of the challenges that comes up specifically with language related to transgender people is that there is a lot of different terminology and different people use terms in different ways. There's no one definition to any of the terms that we use, so we want to give you the ways in which we're using these terms so that we can be very clear. So Michael, if you can advance to the next slide. Great. So when we say biological sex, we are referring to the sex that somebody was assigned at birth. Usually this is based on somebody's presentation of genitals and also involves a combination of hormones and chromosomes, typically speaking. When we say gender identity, we're referring to a person's internal sense of self, of who they are as a gendered being. When we say transgender, we're referring to someone whose gender identity and biological sex are incongruent, so specifically somebody who was assigned a certain sex at birth, but later in their life, at whatever age that may be, comes to the realization that that assignment is inaccurate. When we say gender expression, we're specifically referring to the various cues that people use to communicate gender. Some examples of this are the different styles of dress that people wear, the different clothing, hair, makeup, jewelry, all of the things when we see other people that we use to try to make determinations about their gender or sexual orientation.
Excuse me, Eli. This is Laurie. People are asking if you can speak a little louder.
I can certainly try.
Thank you.
Sure. So when we say gender nonconforming, we're speaking about a person whose gender expression is not perceived as traditionally masculine or feminine. So gender nonconforming is not typically an identity that somebody claims for themselves, but it is a way for us to describe other people who may not fit the conventional norms of being masculine or feminine. When we're talking about sexual orientation, we're specifically referring to who a person is physically, psychologically, romantically, and sexually attracted to. We are not just talking about sex or who somebody wants to have sex with, but we're talking about who somebody wants to have relationships with, who somebody wants to partner with. When we use the phrase sexual practices or sexual behavior, we're talking about the specific ways in which people engage in sexual contact, either with themselves or with other people. And finally, when we use the term medical transition, we're referring to the medical interventions that someone might use, such as hormones or surgery, to change their bodies to be more in line with their gender identity. If we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So one of the things that we really want you to know is that sexuality is complex for everyone. Sexuality, by its very nature, involves a lot of components, and everybody's experiences of it is different. So we start off with this saying sexuality is complex for everyone, and for transgender people, there are often additional complexities that need to be navigated. For example, transgender people often have to make decisions about how and when to disclose their identity or their history to potential partners in dating situations. Language used to describe genitals can be triggering. It can be hard to communicate the preferred and affirming language to partners. So if one has genitals that have not been surgically changed, it may be uncomfortable for a partner to refer to those based on an assigned sex. Another example is financial implications on relationships. Paying for medical transition or alternative avenues of becoming parents can add additional complexities to relationships. Next slide. Thank you. Transgender people are fully capable of and do have happy and healthy relationships. And this is really essential because what we're talking about in this webinar are some of the challenges that present uniquely for transgender people. But we don't want to give the impression that it is just a negative situation that people have to navigate. There are very much people who have healthy and happy relationships. Many transgender people have extensive resiliencies that help with navigating these complexities. And one of the things that I think we all work for in this is that an increase in understanding and acceptance of transgender people will help diminish some of the challenges that people are facing and make things easier for everyone across the board. Next, please. So by trade, I am a sexuality educator. And so the slide that you have in front of you is Dallas Denny's Circles of Sexuality. And this is a way of talking about the ways that sexuality are multifaceted and complex. So specifically, we have 5 circles here that you see in front of you. We have intimacy, which talks about the ways in which people exchange emotional closeness. We have sexual health and reproduction. That is more about the physical ways in which our bodies function and work, along with sexual health pieces such as sexually transmitted infections or reproductive systems. Sensuality is the way that we use our senses to experience pleasure physically and psychologically. Power and sexualization refers to the role of power and sexuality both in a positive sense and potentially an abusive sense, including the ways that we learn about sexuality from the world. And the 5th circle that we have is who we are and how we label ourselves and our desires. So if we look at all of these circles, this is just an overview of what the 5 circles are. For every circle, there's actually several subheadings that go underneath it. And because that's a little bit beyond what we're doing here in this webinar today, we've provided you with a handout that explains these in more depth if you are interested. So the piece of this is that when we sat down to write this webinar, we were very quickly overwhelmed. We're like, how do we capture the complexity of sexuality in 90 minutes? So the way that we've done this, we have pared it down to 4 components of sexuality that we feel are particularly relevant for providers or other people who are working with trans folks. So we're talking about identity first as a foundation for the other 3 specifically. Relationships tend to be a key theme. Sexual practices and behavior is our 3rd. And finally, we'll be discussing sexual health. We're taking these pieces specifically and discussing about them, but we don't in any way assume that this represents everybody's experience, nor does it represent every aspect of sexuality. This is really just a 101 session here. So we'll start off with identity. Michael, if we can actually go to the next slide as well. So one of the biggest misconceptions, next slide, please. We'll get there. One of the biggest misconceptions is that transgender is a sexual orientation. Because of the way that we use the phrase LGBT, oftentimes many people assume that the T also includes a sexual orientation. So one of the first things that we want to make very clear is that transgender is not a sexual orientation. Transgender is very specifically about somebody who has a assigned biological sex and a gender identity that are incongruent. All people, regardless of whether they identify as transgender or not, have a biological sex, have a gender identity, and have a sexual orientation, which means that transgender people also have a sexual orientation that is separate and distinct from their gender identity. For those of us who work with transgender people, specifically, being transgender can be the thing that gets focused on the most, but that really only reflects part of someone's identity. So it's really important that we make very clear that there is a distinction, and everybody also has a sexual orientation that is separate. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, what is a transgender person's sexual orientation? So usually this comes in the form of, if somebody was assigned this sex at birth and identify this way and medically transition to something that is more in line with their gender identity, what is their sexual orientation? And the important point to take away here is that there is no one sexual orientation that people identify with. Overall, we can say that people are often attracted to similar people, both before and after medical transition. Different people are attracted to different people no matter what. Assigned sex is not particularly relevant to how sexual orientation is labeled. So for example, what somebody was assigned at birth doesn't really often enter into how somebody chooses an identity label for themselves. More often, that is very specific to the person's gender identity. Regardless of the label that somebody chooses, that should always be respected. We can talk about mirroring back language in which somebody says that they identify as queer or asexual, then that's the language that should be used back when speaking about their sexual orientation. Another key piece is that when we're asking questions about a person's the gender of their partners, we need to think about why we're asking these questions and make sure that we're asking with purpose and intention. Next slide, please. So another question that I get asked frequently is, how does medical transition impact sexual orientation? So this is a really common question. There's an assumption that people's sexual orientation changes during medical transition, and that is, well, sometimes true, not always true. As we said, people are most likely to be attracted to the person that they are, type of person that they are attracted to prior to transition. So things, orientation may become more broad. People may become more attracted to more types of people, or the reverse can happen and people can be attracted to less types of people. Just like with anybody, regardless of whether or not they're transgender, who we are attracted to shifts over time. So who we're attracted to at 15 may not be who we're attracted to at 25, may not be who we're attracted to at 55. So the shifting over time in life stages is completely normal. Next slide, please.
So this is
Michael, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you. And I wanted to apologize to both people that are listening and to Eli that sometimes the slides just kind of don't refresh quite as fast. So if you're having a little bit of a lag, that's a technology thing, not a my fingers are slow thing, I don't think. So, so what I mentioned at the beginning is that Eli was going to present this little chunk of information, which he just did, and then I'll give us a little bit of framework for providers. So here's kind of the implications for providers, and I've got a couple of slides, and then Eli will shift back into talking about those other 4 components. So with this is an obvious slide for a lot of people about not making an assumption about things. So it's really critical for all of us to remember that trans and gender nonconforming people might be straight, they might be gay or lesbian or bisexual, or queer, or pansexual, or asexual. Those are just naming a few orientations or identities. A person's sexual identity or sexual orientation may look and feel differently to them than it does to you as a provider. So similarly, people may be in a partnership that may have different ways of labeling or talking about their sexuality or their sexual orientation. Some people are deeply rooted in and value their connection to the LGBT community. They may maintain a sexual orientation or an identity label that allows them to stay connected to and in the community that they felt at home in for so long. So what this might mean is that a person who may emerge from the LGBT community prior to exploring their gender may want to stay connected to the queer community, even if they're now in a relationship that might appear to be heterosexual to you as a provider or to the world. So this may have some service implications in terms of providers who offer groups specifically to LGBT people, and sometimes what that ends up meaning is that the groups are designed for people who are in same-sex relationships or same-gendered relationships. And oftentimes, you know, some trans people want to still be involved in those groups and those service provisions, even if they have what looks to be an opposite-gendered partner. So keep in mind that if a survivor was recently sexually assaulted or just experienced an incident of intimate partner violence, their sexual identity or sexual orientation is likely going to be highly irrelevant to the services that they're seeking. They likely need medical attention or shelter or safety of some kind or whatever the service is that they're calling your office about or came in to see you about. It's important to address their urgent and immediate needs. Your questions and their volunteered information is likely not going to expand to cover things like their sexual orientation, unless it was a central component of the assault that just happened. If they arrive with a companion, it's important to determine what the relationship is between the two people. Again, you don't need to know their sexual orientation. That's not what's critical here. But what's critical is to know if the companion might be an abuser. So finding a way to talk with the survivor alone, even if it's just for a few minutes, will help you determine if the person that they're with is somebody that they would like to have with them, or if that companion is a possible abuser. So if the survivor does initiate discussion around their sexual orientation or their sexual identity, then of course it's appropriate to continue that dialogue as much as that survivor wants to go in those directions. So those are just some of the implications for providers around identity. So Eli, can you take us back and give us a framework for the next section?
Of course. So the piece that we want to focus on now that we've covered some of the basic pieces of identity, is to specifically talk about the ways that this impacts other people's sexual engagement in relationships. So all of these things are very much connected. The ways that we engage in relationships with other people is connected to our gender identities. The ways in which we engage in sexual health and preventative measures is engaged based on our gender identity or components thereof. And the sexual behaviors that we engage in are also related. And so each of these complements and works with each other for everyone, in particularly for transgender people. Next slide, please. So the main piece that we're going to focus on now is talking about specifically relationships and the ways that transgender identity can impact a person's relationship. Next slide. So one of the main things, as we said earlier, relationships and sexuality can be challenging. That is certainly true. How do we find partners? Who do we want to be with? How do we communicate with them? How do we build the loving, healthy, caring relationships that we want? All of these challenges exist for transgender people as well, and then there are additional layers of complexity. So, for example, if somebody is in a relationship with a partner while they're coming out and navigating their identity, it may be difficult in the long-term partnership. So it may cause, and often does cause, additional strain and stress on a relationship, more things that need to be navigated. The person's transition or gender exploration impacts both or all partners. For example, if someone enters into a relationship with someone under the assumption that both people are female, they may identify as lesbians. If somebody of this partnership medically transitions or desires to transition or identifies as male, that sexual orientation label can come into question. So if somebody who identifies as a lesbian is in a relationship with someone who identifies as a man, how does that impact the relationship specifically? Do labels need to change? There's no one answer for how people navigate that, but it's often something that is complex and handled on an individual basis. The different ways in which people engage in sexual behavior may be impacted. Things such as medical transition will impact the way that somebody potentially engages in sexual behavior. Whether or not somebody has children or wants children in the future will also be impacted. Generally speaking, many people fear that their partner may leave, that stress and challenges related to gender identity may be too stressful on the relationship, and that partner may leave. And that goes both ways. It can be that the person who is not identifying as transgender leaving, or it can also be the person who does identify as transgender leaving the relationship for any number of reasons. So it's a very common theme and scenario that people have stress or fear over partners leaving. Another piece is that existing partners may not have a lot of knowledge about transgender identity. While in society we tend to have more information about people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, the general knowledge of folks around transgender identity is still somewhat limited. Just because a potential partner identifies as transgender doesn't mean that that person or that partner is automatically going to come with large amounts of information and background about transgender identity. Next slide, please. For people who are not in relationships while coming out but seek to be at later times, again, we have a similar place where there are all the usual challenges of how do I meet somebody, do I like them, what does flirting look like, where do we go? All of those complexities are still there. What's added on to that is, again, an additional general lack of knowledge about transgender identity. So for example, if someone is trying to engage in dating on an online site, they may find that people are asking inappropriate questions or having different responses to them based on the disclosure of transgender identity. There is more so a limited dating pool of people open to relationships with transgender people. Often there's prejudice and stigma against transgender people, and this can always often present in a form of curiosity rather than an interest in a relationship. So for finding someone who is affirming of transgender people to be in a relationship may feel like or may actually be more of a challenge. Online dating and hookup apps are generally not transgender inclusive or sensitive to the person. Some users may be, others may not. Different apps and different sites don't even include transgender options for people to be categorized that way if they want to, so that's an additional challenge. And finally, there are also concerns that some people who seek out transgender partners may be doing so out of a fetish for transgender people based on stereotypes around pornography and other pieces. So one of the pieces that people have to navigate is finding out whether or not a person is affirming or whether or not they are non-consensually fetishizing. Next slide, please. Coming out in disclosure. As a part of getting to know someone in a dating relationship, there's always the piece of how much do you tell about yourself at any given point. That is particularly true for transgender people. When you have to make decisions about when to disclose to someone, do you post that? If it's an online setting in your dating profile, do you wait to meet the person? Do you tell them before first kiss or first sexual contact? Do you tell them later? Do you tell them not at all? And each of those options comes with different challenges specifically and different potential levels for rejection. It is a common reaction that people do experience discomfort with the idea of dating someone who is transgender, and so the fear of rejection is real. There are also situations where people react violently to finding out that somebody that they were interested in dating is transgender and may react violently, and we know that historically and throughout the community data. An additional piece is that there is a burden to teach or explain transgender identity. So if someone is trying to enter into a relationship with someone who does not have a level of transgender awareness, it falls typically on that potential partner to educate the other about what transgender means. And again, there are also concerns about physical safety for those who are uncomfortable with the idea of dating a transgender person. Next slide, please. One of the pieces, assuming that everybody wants to be in a healthy relationship, one has to work actively to create it. They don't just happen. And again, that is a challenge for everybody who engages in relationships. For transgender people, there are additional challenges. One is that there are fewer transgender role models in healthy relationships that people in communities can look to and say, this is what the model of a healthy relationship looks like, and I don't see myself in those models. So the lack of availability can make it harder for somebody to understand what a healthy and affirming relationship might be. Depending on the stage of coming out or stage of medical transition, there may be rapid or significant amounts of change. If somebody is changing physically and going through medical transition, there may be very concrete physical changes that occur very rapidly. If psychologically speaking, people, when coming out, things may shift very quickly for them as well around that. The next piece is that navigating identities may become a central theme of the relationship. So rather than focusing on the relationship as an independent thing, it can become about being transgender and how do we navigate being transgender in a relationship. So that can take away from some of the energy that is put into building into a healthy relationship. Another piece is how both partners will handle the impact of discrimination. So it is very, very well documented that transgender people have higher rates of discrimination across the board, which has impacts on things like mental health and income and employment, safety in the world in general, and that stress will impact somebody's relationship, both for the person who is or identifies as transgender and the partners. Finally, the path to becoming parents may be more complicated. Adoption laws, depending on the state, may be a challenge. If somebody wishes to have children that are biologically related to them, that can involve a lot of advanced planning, which may or may not be financially accessible. There are additional challenges and questions around carrying children or conceiving children as well. Next slide, please. So for the role of partners, partners often play a central role in affirming a person's gender identity. So if someone is in a relationship and their partner is coming out, there is an increased amount of pressure or burden on a partner to be the person who affirms and make sure that that person understands that they are respected for their gender identity. Partners are often essential in role modeling affirmation for other people in their lives. So many people may go to a partner and say, what's going on? Is that person transitioning? How do they identify? What pronouns should I use? And we'll ask those questions of a partner rather than asking those questions of the transgender person themselves. So partners may have an increased role there in making sure that they are role modeling affirmation. Partners may be asked to emotionally, physically, and financially support medical transition. Not all people who identify as transgender wish to medically transition. And not all who desire to medically transition are able to do so. For those who are in partnerships, they may be asked to provide additional support around either being able to navigate medical transition as they desire or financially support medically transition as well. Depending on the situation, partners can often be invisible and have less sources of support to access while a partner is transitioning. Many people will focus on the transgender person's transition without understanding or reflecting on the impact that that may have on a partner. Even the most affirming partner is likely to have some sort of impact related to them. And as we mentioned earlier, labels then may become problematic because they have to shift on occasion depending on where orientation and identity ends up. Michael?
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk for about 4 slides worth of implications for providers. So we all make assumptions, and I think the goal is to not pass along those assumptions to our clients and who we're working with. So, you know, obviously I know the slide says don't assume, but I think we all make assumptions. So what do we want to look out for about the assumptions that we might be making and how we don't want to push those along to our clients? So with trans people and partners, it's important to keep in mind that some partners might be extremely supportive, accepting, and celebratory of their trans partner, while others might not be. Similarly, many people assume that individuals who are in intimate or committed relationships are sexually active. This may or may not be true for all partners. Just as some partners may not be sexually active but are romantically or emotionally connected, some partners are monogamous while other people are not. Some relationships have high levels of sexual or romantic attraction, while other partnerships may not. These are just a few of the areas where it's important to not make assumptions. Partners may jointly come to your agency, for example, to the emergency room or a medical crisis center. After talking to the survivor alone to make sure that the partner is not the person who has caused harm, it's important to follow the client's lead and preferences around their pronoun and name, as well as how they refer to their partner, their relationship, their body, things like that. You may hear their partner refer to them by a different name or pronoun. And sometimes I think we're all really quick to want to correct them or correct other people when we believe that we're hearing something that's disrespectful or incorrect. So I'd like us to kind of keep in mind that relationships are really complex. Eli's been talking about the complexity of relationships, and we need to keep that in mind. And we don't know, as providers, we don't know the history of their relationship. We don't know their stories. We don't know why they might be using the language that they do. So it's perfectly fine to talk to the trans person, that's the survivor, that's presumably your primary client coming in, and ask them, you know, what would you like me to call you by name? What pronoun would you like? What language would you like me to use around your body? But it's also okay to allow that partner and their partnership interaction to continue using the language that they do. So I've referenced this a few times already, but it does bear repeating that if a partner comes to an agency with a trans survivor, it's really important to pursue at some level some screening to determine if one of the people in the partnership is abusive or causing harm to the others. It's really important to keep in mind, too, that both trans and non-trans people can act in abusive and harmful ways. So when you're screening, it's important to make sure that all people are talked to. So if it's 2 people in a relationship or more, talk to every single person that's in that relationship to assess if there's an abusive dynamic that's occurring. Being in a relationship with someone who has experienced sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, or hate-motivated violence can be very difficult and draining. Secondary survivors, partners, and those who love and surround the survivor may have very specific and unique challenges that need direct support. Oftentimes, providers focus on how the secondary survivor can support the primary survivor or the trans survivor. It's really important that we be aware that the secondary survivor may have issues that need to be dealt with on their own that range from things like being exhausted from being woken up by their partner's nightmares, or the strain of not being able to have sex without their partner ending up in tears, or having a lot of negotiation around sexuality. It could relate to fears of being re-victimized or having additional harm happen to their partner or to their family. So there's a lot of things that secondary survivors might be challenged with, and they may need support on their own that's separate from or in addition to what the trans survivor is needing for support. So Eli, can you talk to us about some sexual behavior?
Absolutely. So if we can actually just go on to the next slide, that would be great. So when we're talking about transgender people and sexual behavior, one of the common questions that I get asked is, okay, so how do transgender people actually have sex? Can people orgasm after medical transition? How does all this work, and how does it happen? And people are typically very interested in logistics. So the things that we want you to understand about this is, for everyone, there is no one way to have sex. There's no such thing as gay sex or as straight sex. We all use our bodies in ways that we find pleasurable. different positions, different parts of our body, and that is regardless of our gender identity or gender expression. We typically engage in sex acts based on desires and what feels good and what pleases our partners, not necessarily what our bodies are. Different people, regardless of gender, navigate sexual acts as best they can. Sometimes we do better than others. Engaging in sexual acts can be challenging for everyone. Communicating what you want, deciding whether or not a partner is being pleased, if you have negative body image, figuring out what feels good, all of those things can be very, very hard. For transgender people, all of this is true, and because of the very gendered nature, in some ways, of being sexual, there are different things that emerge as well. So similarly as to people who are not transgender, there is no one way that any transgender person has sex. There are different people who use their bodies in different ways. People use their hands, their mouths, their genitals, and other body parts in combinations that are pleasurable. Some people use prosthetics or sex toys, and some do not. Some people enjoy penetration, and some do not. Some people are okay being touched. Some aren't. Some people are okay being touched in certain places and not in others. Next slide, please. When we put all of this together, what we have is the idea that people have sexual desire. Obviously, as Michael said, people have different levels and ranges of sexual desire. What then emerges is that a person's body is different than their identity. So a person may want to have a specific physical body that is not available or attainable to them. By virtue of having sexual contact that often involves genitals, that may trigger dysphoria for people, which is to say a very intense sense that their body is not what they want it to be and that is uncomfortable. And on top of that, then we have to navigate the challenges that come with that, in addition to all the other challenges that we typically navigate while being sexual. Next slide, please. We have this visual image here to give you an idea of what some people may be thinking while they're engaging in sexual contact. So this, again, is not representative of everybody, but are just some key themes here. So for example, will sex change how my partner sees me? Will my partners be okay with what I need? If I need certain parts of my body not to be touched or only touched in certain types of ways, can I trust my partner to do that? Being unsure of what's pleasurable, what feels good or what doesn't feel good, and that may change over time and by situation. Not wanting to be seen without clothes on, not feeling that a person is able to be present during sexual contact. Specifically, sometimes people may choose to be drunk or high or use other substances so that they're able to be sexual and manage some of the dysphoria that comes up. For some people, there aren't safer sex materials such as condoms, dental dams, and other pieces that fit bodies in the same way. Traditional methods may not be available. Being triggered with certain types of touch, as we mentioned, fewer number of partners. The ideas of, I think for all people, it is really difficult sometimes in sexual contact to ask for what it is we want and what feels good. It can be even harder to do so when your body doesn't respond in the way that other people's might, or when there aren't really the words to describe what a person wants. So next slide, please. What happens when we put all of this together is we see that all of these pieces are interconnected. So the fact that somebody's genitals aren't what they want them to be, or their body doesn't respond in the same way to other people, can make it harder to ask for what they want sexually. The fact that there are no safer sex materials may be a challenge. That is connected particularly to, will a person still want to be sexual with me if I ask for safer sex materials to be used? If I don't want to be seen with my clothes on, or if I don't want to be touched in certain ways, will my partners be okay with that? How can I trust them to meet my needs for that? So we just wanted to give you an idea of how interconnected these challenges are and how they link together specifically. The overlap of all these challenges means that contact can be particularly challenging and particularly triggering. Most people do figure out ways to navigate it in ways that feel comfortable, and that can change in situations or different times. It will also impact the amount of emotional energy that somebody has available to ask or demand that safer sex materials be used, or that emotionally safe practices are happening. Michael, would you like to cover some of the implications for providers?
You bet. And before I move on to that, I wanted to note that Eli created this chart, this map, specifically for this webinar, and I know it's difficult to see on the screen, and the handout is going to be available on our website, and it'll be mailed to you tomorrow in the follow-up email. But I really encourage people to look at all of the details of this because it's just a fantastic representation, and it's just a small little bit out of what we all navigate sexually and what trans people in particular navigate. So it's a amazingly beautiful and brilliant chart. So what are some of the implications for providers around sexual behavior and practices? And I'm sure that you've all caught on to the idea that the first slide is about not making assumptions. So we all know this, but it's worth repeating a little bit. So here are a couple of things around which we don't want to make assumptions. So no two people are the same, like the same things or engage in the same type of sexual behavior. So it's important to note that we don't want to jump to conclusions around what kind of sex somebody has by themselves or with a partner or partners, or what somebody might enjoy or not enjoy. For example, some partners may presume that all trans men would not want any vaginal or front hole penetration, or that trans women would not find pleasure from their penis or from the erogenous tissue that's in the front of their body. We can't make that assumption because we just can't make that assumption without having some conversations with people around what their sexuality and their sexual behaviors are like. A quick note about triggers. It's easy for trans people, partners and therapists, service providers, to presume that specific sexual behaviors would be triggering when they may not be for a certain survivor. Some people may presume that a trigger stems from the abuse or assault that the person's experienced, while other people might assume that that very same trigger is related to the person's gender or their gender history. Once again, we don't really know until we have some conversations with the survivor if and when they're ready to talk about these kinds of subjects. As victim service providers, most of us have been trained to not have judgments, at least not to express them to our clients, and to be open-minded. Sometimes when we see behaviors in our clients, it's hard to not question why they're doing something or why they are behaving in a certain way that seems to be kind of counterintuitive. Some trans people may not engage in safer sex practices, for example, and may routinely put themselves at risk for sexually transmitted infections or HIV. There may be many complicated and complex reasons why a trans person is not using barriers, just to play off of that example. And again, we won't know until we actually have some deeper discussions with them about their choices, their history, and their knowledge around safer sex behaviors or using barriers. Similarly, trans people may choose to disclose or not disclose their transness to sexual partners or to you or to other people. Usually these choices are very conscious and very calculated, with persons weighing the risks around, when do I tell? When is it safest to tell somebody? How can I best navigate my life and my world? So the lack of disclosure, or if and how and when somebody chooses to disclose, can be a very complicated process, and it's a hard decision for some people. So as service providers, I think sometimes it's easy for us to move into a victim-blaming mentality, even if we don't directly express it, when we hear our client saying that they didn't disclose or they didn't use protection or some of those things. So there's generally a more complicated story behind it if we can sit back and listen. As Eli was mentioning, there are some off-limit parts for some trans people, and that can be related to trauma or gender dysphoria. And we aren't going to really know either of those things, what the cause is of those off-limits, I don't want this part of my body touched, until we have some conversations. I did want to make a note about this particular image, and it's one that I find to be just really amazing. And hopefully most of you are being able to look at your screen. It's a photo that was taken by Marriott Pathy Allen, and it is of Maxwell Anderson, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, but he's in the process of shaving his partner's leg. And I think part of what I find so beautiful about it is that it's definitely a very sensual image. It's a very, very erotic image in a lot of ways, and it's about shaving somebody's leg, which I think a lot of people would not necessarily think of as something sensual. So I wanted to include it because I think it's really beautiful and it captures the diversity of sexuality and sexual behavior. So specific types of sex can be gender affirming, and I know Eli has mentioned that a couple of times. It can enhance a person's sense of their femaleness, their maleness, or what other genderedness they embody. Some of these behaviors may be based on myths or on stereotypes, and may be based on misinformation. So for example, a trans woman may have been told that real women engage in sex without protection, without barriers. Or she may have been told, to be a woman, you need to like it rough. Because of such a high desire to be affirmed in a current gender identity and validated as a woman, many trans women will believe these myths and engage in behaviors that they wouldn't normally prefer to engage in. Unfortunately, many of those behaviors, what they hoped would be gender affirming, end up causing additional layers of harm or abuse or even sometimes death. Due to economic disparities, many trans people being discriminated against in employment, and a substantial number of there are substantial numbers of trans people who have worked in the street economy, engaging in sex for money or to cover other basic survival needs. For some people, sex work is a very consensual choice, even if it's not an ideal one, but it also brings with it an increased level of sexual risk, so sexually transmitted infections and HIV, as well as an increase in risk of physical and emotional violence. Some people who engage in sex for money or for survival needs may be offered additional money if they engage in specific sexual acts, which might be outside of what they would typically agree to in a consensual personal relationship, and it may include things like not using protection, which again places them at greater risk. So Eli, can you bring us through number 4, which is sexual health?
Absolutely. So as we put all of these pieces together, we've talked about identity, we have talked about relationships, and we have talked about different sexual behaviors. Now we want to talk to you specifically about sexual health. We know that there is oftentimes studies that indicate that transgender people are at higher risk for HIV. Nobody is particularly at risk because they are transgender, but for the reasons that Michael outlined, people may engage in different sexual behaviors that may place them at higher risk. Transgender people may be less likely to get tested, both for sexually transmitted infections and for annual exams such as Pap smears or prostate exams. Both of those spaces, both sexually transmitted infection testing and annual exams, are often very gendered. So if somebody who appears male goes to the gynecologist and there are questions about why would this man be here, then that can cause barriers and trauma for a person who is trying to access those services, in addition to that, the challenge that most people find getting tested for sexually transmitted infections in particular to be stressful to begin with. There is less access to medical providers that are culturally competent about transgender people's bodies. We know by virtue of a national survey that medical settings are one of the places where transgender people experience high levels of discrimination consistently. So be that whether or not somebody has negative remarks made about them, are mistreated by staff, or accidentally outed by the people at the front desk handling insurance and documents, that confidentiality isn't protected, that the providers themselves are very unclear on how to work with transgender people, and transgender people's bodies in particular can create specific barriers. And as we said, medical providers are consistently a source of discrimination and prejudice. So Michael, can you talk to us about what the implications for providers are when we're talking about sexual health?
You bet. So first slide again, there's 5 areas that I'm going to address fairly briefly around sexual health. So the first one is, again, to not make assumptions. So it's critical to not make assumptions about somebody's sexual health or their sexual behavior. For example, a person might be asexual and not be at risk for HIV or STIs. Of course, it's important to believe them that they're asexual, but it's also important to make sure that they have accurate information and the services that they need that are appropriate to their experiences. A person may be highly sexually active and always use barriers, and another person might be an HIV educator for a living but engage in unprotected sex. So there's a lot of variables about where we might make an assumption and what might actually be true. So we can't know, too, if somebody has been regularly HIV tested, for example, or what kinds of treatment or prevention they have engaged in the past. We don't know if somebody has previously accessed care or if barriers have been in their way to receiving services sooner than before they arrived in your office. Most people are aware that when non-trans women have a pelvic exam or any form of treatment that involves their genitals or reproductive organs, a female staff member or a person's family member or friend is asked to be in the room during the exam. I think that's pretty standard practice throughout the country. In a lot of places, that's a legal requirement. Similarly, in many areas, non-trans male patients who are having genital-related exams are having a male person in the room when those exams are happening, if the physician is female. We won't go into the gendered nature of that, but that's the typical practice. So, a question that I think we have when we look at trans people is, when a trans person is going to have a genital exam, are they offered the option of having another person in the room with them during the exam? If so, are they allowed to determine the gender of that person? Well, it's certainly the intent of reducing potential inappropriate provider behavior by having another person present during those exams. It can also make patients of any gender identity really uncomfortable or really self-conscious to have another person in the room. So with trans clients, it may make them feel even more uncomfortable to have another person in the room, raising their anxieties and requiring additional levels of disclosure or other fears, especially like if it's in rural areas, if they actually know who the other person is and they may not want to be out to them. It can also be a source of comfort to have somebody else in the room as well. So if you work as an advocate or a medical provider, it's important, I think, to ask your client about if and who they would like to have in the room with them during an exam. And I think this is true both for genital exams as well as any other kind of exam. So seeing the provider for a possible sexually transmitted infection or any other sexual health need can be really scary for anybody. Generally, that's not something that we go for if we think that we're healthy. We generally are going because we might be worried about something. It can be really scary and uncomfortable to see a provider when a person is experiencing like pain during sexual interactions or perhaps other challenges associated with their sexuality. Whether somebody is, for example, just having their blood drawn to check for a sexually transmitted infection, or if it's more revealing, like a physical exam, the process can be really traumatizing in and of itself, even for those people who don't have a trauma history. For trans people, there may be an additional layer of fear or discomfort or questioning the trust about if the provider will actually be culturally competent, if they'll ask inappropriate questions or not, and if the provider will be able to assess and provide competent and respectful medical care. Being really clear about your policies and procedures can be helpful in reassuring to trans and non-trans clients seeking sexual health services. Let them know what you'd like to do, ask their permission, and give them as much narration and feedback as is helpful to that client. One of the things that I heard recently was that a trans client who had experienced a fairly substantial trauma history found it to be really uncomfortable to have the provider narrating what they were going to do. And we know that other survivors really want to know, want to have control about what's going to happen. So it's really important, I think, to ask trans survivors, what's your level of comfort? Would you like me to tell you what's happening, or would you like me to just be quiet? Historically, trans people have been uninsured or underinsured, more so than the majority of the population. This is changing. Affordable Care Act is one of those reasons that it's changing. But for the reason that people have been uninsured or underinsured, as well as from previous negative experiences with providers or fears about being mistreated, many trans people have not had adequate or routine medical care. Fewer still have had medical care that addressed their sexual health. Being aware that some trans people have had very limited previous contact with providers and sexual health exams and treatment, it might mean that a bit more time and explanation are necessary in order for the client to feel comfortable enough for them to proceed. And last, I wanted to talk about tools. I'm going to talk about two different kinds of tools. Trans bodies may or may not be similar to non-trans bodies. It's often not helpful to provide trans people with, for example, like a handful of condoms and a brochure on how to engage in safer sex, because it presumes a couple of things. It presumes that there's a penis involved, and it also presumes that condoms would be an appropriate barrier around any sexual activity that the person might have. For many trans feminine individuals who have not had genital surgery, their bodies may not result in an erection, for example, when aroused, so it would be impossible to roll a condom on. So there might need to be other methods and other tools used to provide a barrier. Likewise, transmasculine individuals who may or may not have had surgery may have erectile tissue that is not easily covered by traditional barriers, so may not be covered easily by condoms or even by dental dams or other devices. So taking time to talk with clients, if they're comfortable sharing about their body and their sexual practices, will help them figure out how to more safely engage in sexual behavior, consensual sexual behavior. It may take some time and some creativity to find a solution that's both physically effective in creating a barrier and emotionally comfortable for them to want to use this method and use it consistently. Another set of tools that might be different for trans clients might be things like speculums or other devices for collecting evidence or performing genital exams. For many trans masculine individuals, especially those who are on testosterone, vaginal tissue becomes a little bit more fragile, a little bit more sensitive for some people. So the vagina itself may actually be tighter and less pliable than a non-trans woman's vagina, for example. So pediatric speculums can be very helpful in making exams more comfortable and, in fact, even possible. So those are a couple of the implications for providers. And we wanted to shift for a few minutes to talk a little bit about some reminders that didn't fit neatly into those categories that we just went through. So most victim service providers will not need to know about a survivor's sexual orientation or consensual sexual behaviors in order to provide the services a survivor is seeking. So if the survivor is seeking rape crisis support or referrals or advocacy or emergency medical care or assistance with victim compensation, the provider is generally not going to need to know much of anything about their sexual orientation or their sexual identity. And there's a big but and a big and that goes with this. So the sexuality of a client might be relevant to some victim service providers and to some trans people seeking care. For example, some survivors may enter into psychotherapy or seek mental health services for support in healing from sexual assault. They may have a specific goal about talking about how sex is something that triggers them, or that their sexual orientation has shifted following an assault, or any number of other healing-related issues that are linked to their sexuality. Sometimes survivors have experienced abuse or assault or stalking, and it's directly related to their gender identity or their sexual orientation. Conversations about sexuality and other components of identity or behavior might be important if someone wants to file a police report or if they want to pursue something related to a hate-motivated bias. A survivor's sexual orientation may be relevant if they need to file a restraining order. And in some areas, it's much more difficult for a person in a same-sex relationship to access restraining orders. So you all need to check in your own local areas to see what's true around restraining orders. It's also difficult sometimes to determine what's a same-sex relationship and what is not when dealing with trans people. There are a lot of other reasons why someone's sexuality, sexual orientation, sexual identity, or sexual behaviors might be relevant or irrelevant to the services that you're providing them. But these are just a couple of overview concepts. So let me leave you with a couple of thoughts before we turn to question and answers. So Eli's mentioned this a bunch of times. I think these have been common themes throughout our time today. So keep in mind that sex and sexuality are normal and complicated and often messy for everyone. When transness is added into the mix, sex and sexuality is still normal and complicated and sometimes messy. Likewise, when trauma is added into the equation, sex and sexuality is still normal and complicated and sometimes messy. So people are complex. When we add more variables and more unique qualities and experiences, the normal might become a little more complicated, a little bit more messy, but everybody is capable of and deserving of happy and healthy relationships. Sometimes it just may take a little bit more work than in other cases. So Eli and I have both mentioned some resources that are available, and the three primary ones, which are already up on our website and will be included in tomorrow's email that you'll receive, are the gender-bread person, the graphic that we saw in the identity section, that map, that beautiful map that Eli created, navigating sexual relationships with all those connectors, and then the 5 circles of sexuality, which was at the very beginning of today's webinar. So those will be available for download for you. So now we have a good amount of time for question and answers. So Luria, have you culled some questions yet?
Yes, I have 3 questions to start us with, and I'll be monitoring for people to put up more. The first question is, sex work can carry a high risk for being traumatized and re-traumatized. For those who choose sex work, what suggestions do you have for a provider working with someone who is traumatized and chooses sex work?
Eli, I'm going to let you do the first pass on probably all of these questions.
I was going to let you do it. So for pieces around sex work specifically, I think that one thing that can happen for folks is that engaging in sex work can be a way to affirm somebody's identity. So if you are engaging with people who see you as a woman, that can be very affirming to your identity as a woman, or likewise, people who engage in what is same-sex contact with you as a male can also be very affirming. So there are actually legitimate reasons why people may choose to engage in sex work that may validate their identity, in addition to helping to meet the specific needs around survival, largely financial implications that enter into that. So Michael, do you want to talk specifically about the trauma pieces?
Well, I think there's a couple things that were very different that came to mind than what you just mentioned, which are really critically important. Yours are very critically important. What I was thinking about was more along the lines of harm reduction, and in not creating a negative client environment where the client feels any shame around the work that they do, and in helping the client with some of those harm reduction strategies, like can they engage in safe calls so that somebody else knows where they are and who they're with? Can they engage in protection? How can they work those things in? How can they work on reducing the amount of harm that might happen? Obviously, that's not we can't, keep them totally safe, but what do we need to do to help them think through some of those risks that they may not have thought through, or some skills that they may not have? And I think the other piece of that is that I think a lot of people are going to be traumatized or re-traumatized, and what can we do to help nurture them, help them heal from those traumas? How can we help them learn about self-care? And I use that in a really, with some air quotes around that. What does that mean to different people, I think is really variable.
This is a follow-up question to that. Do you really think it can be affirming to engage in sex work?
This is Michael. I definitely think that it is for a lot of trans women in particular.
I would agree with that as well. I think that affirmation is not a unilateral piece that is something either is or is not affirming. I think sex work in particular can be and is multi-layered and complex, and one piece of that complexity is that it can be very affirming, and it can be a very direct access to that affirmation in a very particular context.
Okay, I'm a little bit lost in my questions at the moment. Here is one that are there any resources for model questions that would be useful when there is a need to know about a client's anatomy or practices? In other words, before a physical exam or when doing safer sex counseling.
So Michael, I can speak to this briefly, and then I'll turn it over to you for specifics. One piece that I encourage providers to look at is very specifically, why are you asking the question, and can that information be gotten from any other source? So typically when working with medical providers, I will say if you can Google the information and find out an answer, then you should do so. So if the question is about how do transgender people have sex, or what is medical transition like? Do you have to have mental health screenings as a part of that? Those questions are general questions that there are general answers to that are not specific to that particular client. So in that case, I encourage folks to use that as a marker, specifically before figuring out which questions to ask, as to whether or not those are appropriate questions for that particular client. Michael, do you want to speak specifically to role model questions?
Yeah, and Lori, could you reread the question for me? Because I heard something a little bit different, and I wanted to make sure that that's what I heard.
Okay. Are there any resources for model questions that would be useful when there is a need to know about a client's anatomy or practices, such as before a physical exam or when doing safer sex counseling?
Got it. And that's the piece that I grabbed onto, and I agree, Eli, that your suggestions of can you Google it is a really great suggestion in general. From a sexual assault perspective, I'm thinking about what's in the SART protocols, and I don't think there's any model questions there, but the SART protocols really do have some good information around trans-specific sexual assault exams and some ways around being sensitive and things like that. One of the things, I'm just going to play off the tangent of sexual assault exams, since that's oftentimes a very anatomy-specific type of exam. One of the things that we really encourage is almost having dialogues without words. So if you have body maps, and those are going to be used to chart injury or chart sexual health issues or damage, you can follow your client's lead about how they refer to things on that body map. Or sometimes it can be really useful to have anatomical dolls, and I know that can sound really demeaning to some people, but by having things that people can pick up and refer to, it allows you to just follow their lead. So it's not even necessarily asking the questions. And I know that's not really directly answering your question.
Okay, this one's a little bit related. Can you talk more about how a counselor can help a client find affirming words and labels for body parts and sex, and give examples?
Eli, go for it.
So just to make sure that I've got the question is around what might be ways to help clients find affirming language, specifically with examples. Yes?
Yes, about body parts and sex.
Okay. I think that there are a variety of different options that are available for people. So if you happen to catch it earlier when Michael was speaking, and he was talking about people who are assigned female at birth or who may have genitals that would be more likely to be categorized as female, he used the phrase front hole, right, instead of vagina. So for example, when we were talking about language that may be triggering, for someone who identifies and lives as a man, having their genitals referred to as a vagina may be very uncomfortable and may be triggering. So front hole is one of the examples that is used, is useful for that, that sometimes people will use. Other phrases that I've heard are people will talk about a mangina instead of a vagina, or we'll talk about front hole or back hole specifically to refer to those behaviors. Unfortunately, I don't know of any specific resources where somebody might be able to pull up a sheet that says, here are the 16 other options that might work for you as far as other pieces of language. So something that might be useful, though maybe a little bit tricky to navigate, is can you refer to somebody's body, or can you help them refer to their body without using traditionally gendered words? So as a sexuality educator, typically I wouldn't say that I want referring to their genitals as down there, though in this particular context that may be more useful. And as Michael said, using gestures instead of words can also be particularly useful. So Michael, I don't know if you have any other specifics that you want to add.
I have a caveat story. When we did a survey in 2007 on sexuality, trans people and sexuality, we asked people what they called their body parts, and I think we had hundreds and hundreds of different responses, unique responses for, what do you call your erectile tissue, or what do you call, the different parts that we typically see as sexual. And so it's just amazing how many creative words people can come up with. And I think as a provider, one of the most affirming things to do is literally to mirror language. So if we reflect language that other people use, that the client's using, that's going to be more validating and affirming, and letting them know that it's okay to own their body and claim their body and use whatever language that makes them feel most comfortable.
Michael, in addition to that, I would also say that it can be useful to validate somebody's experience that using particular language is uncomfortable, but that may be the best language that they have available. And so acknowledging that and then validating that as well for someone who may not have the words at the ready to use, that might also be helpful.
Exactly. And I think, back to kind of the question before this, kind of are there best practice models for asking questions? One of the things that I think providers can do, and I think this is true for a lot of different kinds of providers, is as a provider you can say something like, generally when we talk about this part of the body, I would normally call it a vagina. What would you like to call it, either for our discussion or about your own body? And so you can phrase it as, this is what we're talking about, but how do you want to hear that reflected?
Okay. The next question is another pretty broad one. Do you have suggestions for educators talking to groups of young people about healthy relationships and dating violence whose audiences may include trans youth?
Absolutely. So I think one of the key pieces that we need to incorporate when we are talking about relationships in general is to do so in a gender-neutral way and not make assumptions about a person's sexual orientation or partnership. So one of the foundational pieces is to make sure that we are framing everything in a gender-neutral way. For example, if we're talking about bodies, we don't have to say a woman's vagina. We can just say a person's vagina. We don't have to say a man's penis. We can talk about a person's penis. And that sounds like a relatively simple shift, but that gives people a lot more room to place themselves within that. When we're talking about healthy relationships, depending on how the information is being taught, I think it's really essential to include transgender people and diverse sexual orientations in the examples that we're using when we're teaching, so that we are not just talking about when Bobby met Susie and here's what happened, to make sure that we are representing true diversity within that for all people's gender identity and sexual orientation, which of course means also that we have to do some base work around making sure that all our students understand what those pieces are as well. Michael, I don't know if you have additional pieces around educating for healthy relationships.
Well, I was wondering, Eli, if you knew of any curriculums that are developed. I think that I've heard that there have been some specific to young people and dating violence, but I don't have any on the top of my head.
I am not familiar with full curriculum that have been written that are transgender inclusive, but I know that there is some really great work with the OWL curriculum, which is the UUA 7-9 curriculum that I, in full disclosure, contributed to, that actively works to make sure that things are gender neutral. There are some lesson plans in the teaching manuals for the Center for Family Life Education that also have gender neutral safer sex practices, how to navigate those. But I don't know anything specific to trans inclusion for general healthy relationship models or even navigating abuse. So it's definitely an area where there is ample opportunity to do more work.
Perfect. Thank you.
Michael, there was quite a bit of confusion about the SART protocol that you talked about. Can you clarify what it is you're speaking about there?
Sure, and Larry, you actually may have the title better than I do. It's the National Protocol for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiners, and they just revised the protocol, and we helped with some of those trans pieces. Larry, do you want to say a little bit more about that, since I know you really contributed to those trans pieces that went into the protocol?
Yes, it's from the Office on Violence Against Women. It's the updated National Protocol for Sexual Assault Medical Forensic Examinations, the second edition. And it talks about, it's very long, it's over 100 pages, talks about how to conduct a sexual assault examination, and it's good because it has best practices for addressing sexual assault issues with people who have been traumatized. So if you're working with sexual assault survivors, I'd recommend that you take a look at it. Next question, any legal concerns we should be thinking about regarding trans students' sexuality and trauma? These are underage students, I believe, that they're talking about.
Eli, would you like to address that?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So that's actually a little bit outside of my range. Do you have a better response around specifically navigating underage reporting for trauma in terms of?
My answer was going to be, I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV, because I don't have an answer for that either. I do think that some of the answers may be available with by contacting the American Bar Association. There's someone specifically there who works full-time on anti-violence issues and is very LGBT culturally competent. So she might be somebody, and I will include that in the follow-up email if I can remember to do that. And the ABA may have some direct guidance.
Right. The main barrier that I would see for transgender students, depending on their age, is that navigating the process of reporting and engaging legal processes is incredibly challenging and hard to begin with, and that person is going to be facing, not necessarily from a legal standpoint, but from engaging with the legal community and all components thereof, really compounded levels of prejudice and lack of information around transgender people that may play a heavy role in how that legal case proceeds.
Okay. Michael, this came in when you were discussing the implications for providers of relationships, and you talked about relationships being complex and the partner may not use the preferred name and pronoun and that sort of thing. And the question that came up was if someone, should service providers ask all of those questions of a trans client? I think you were talking about their pronoun, their name, whether they wanted you, whether the trans person wanted you to correct people who use the incorrect name or pronoun.
Yeah, I think there can be, it depends on obviously what the client, what kind of provider you are, what kind of distress or non-distress the client is in. I mean, I think a conversation in the emergency room is going to be really different than a conversation in a therapist's office. So I do think it's definitely appropriate to ask the trans client, and I think, you know, ideally maybe one-on-one if that's possible, what their preference is, if it's okay with them to hear their partner referring to them in a different way than what they're asking you to refer to them as. But I definitely think it's appropriate to ask, and to be respectful to the trans client, it's an important dialogue to pursue.
Okay, more simple question, what is the difference between bisexuality and pansexuality?
So when we talk about sexual orientation, talking about being attracted to more than one gendered type of person, some people will use the term bisexuality, saying that they are attracted generally to men and women, whereas pansexuality is usually used to refer to more of an attraction to people first rather than gender first.
I'd like to just add a little bit of an aside to that, which is I know some trans people have difficulties with the word bisexual because it implies two genders, so may choose other words like pansexual or queer just to avoid that binary concept.
Allison Cleveland wrote, we will soon offer a webinar on post-sexual assault medical and forensic exams for trans survivors. I am not placing Allison Cleveland's name at the moment. I did ask her for more details because that we'd love to pass that along when we get more details on that.
Maria, are there other questions? I know that we've got just a couple of minutes left.
I'm not really capturing some of these resources that are being mentioned. Is there a way to send those out to us, such as the UU curriculum and the gender-neutral safer sex curriculum?
Yes, we will do our best to try to capture them all, and if you don't see something and you recall something, just send us a note and we will try to find it for you and send it back to you.
Could you please give an example of being gender neutral with a transgender client during a sexual assault exam? I think you did give some of those examples. What is the proper age to begin talking to young individuals about transgender?
That's a really great question. I know that you can't see me smiling, but I am actually smiling. I think that that's a very personal question for some people, depending, but I don't think that there is an age at which we start talking about sexuality, and I don't think that there is an age at which children start learning about sexuality. It is something that happens from birth until death, if not before birth, actually. And the messages that young people in the world are receiving about sex and sexuality are there whether or not we are speaking about them. So I don't think that there is an age at which we start talking about transgender identity specifically. I think that there are some really great models that talk about, with kids who are a little bit younger, maybe 5 to 7, saying, sometimes people who are assigned as girls or boys at birth don't necessarily feel that way when they get older, in very simple terms, and then increasing complexity as people move forward and continue to grow developmentally and cognitively. There's also the piece, for me, that is really important here, that nobody is ever too young to start learning about acceptance and respect, and that is something that we can make sure that we are always including throughout somebody's life, including examples around transgender identity.
One other here. Also, do you have any resources or references for best ways to counsel on safer sex for trans people, not necessarily in a context of trauma? I'm a primary care physician assistant, and so screening, counseling, education on safer sex is an important part of the job.
That's also a really great question. I know that there are some resources available, and Michael and I, why don't we touch base after this and see if we can find the links for those and get those passed along.
Sure, and I have some of them collected already. Forge has 2 very brief resources on safer sex for trans feminine folks and trans masculine folks, and I'm sure that you've got some other ones that we don't have, but we have another list of them as well. So great. We will send those out. They may not go out in tomorrow's resource list, but we will try to make sure that they get up and posted sometime soon.
Another question, are there any words or questions to avoid when working with transgender sexual assault victims? And this is being asked by someone in the victim advocate role.
Eli, would you like to answer?
Michael, why don't you go ahead and I'll jump on if there's anything I have to add.
I think that I always feel a little bit nervous about those questions about what to avoid or what to do, because I think when we're working with clients that it's really important to follow their lead. So I wouldn't say that there's anything that you should always avoid, or always do, because every client is really different. So that's not probably a very satisfying answer, but I think it's the answer that's going to get you the farthest with a client is if you follow their lead.
I would agree. I would also say that there are in some language that is more likely to be read negatively, such as words like tranny is typically referred to as offensive. Some people may identify with that term positively, but there are words like that that may be used with more caution.
Exactly.
This is another basic question. Maybe we'll make this a last question. If a client comes in and the provider suspects they are transgender, should they ask? It could be relevant to the intervention.
Eli?
I'm thinking this through, and what occurs to me is, again, going back to the why are we asking. So I would want to know what the relevance is and make sure that it is truly relevant to the provision of care in that particular setting. I don't recommend asking people just out of the sense of curiosity. And before asking, I would want to make sure that I communicated as a provider that I really am affirming and supportive and know what I'm talking about and why I'm asking. So for example, if that is a concern, somebody might say something along the lines of, I know that some people have different experiences with their bodies and different genital configurations, and I want to make sure that I'm giving the most respectful care. Is there anything you would like me to know before proceeding? And using that type of language to demonstrate affirmation before asking a client whether or not to disclose. Michael, do you have an additional perspective?
I think that's great, and I think one of the ways that we can kind of ease into some of those conversations are around things like if you introduce yourself to a new client, you say, I'm Dr. Joe, but please call me this. What would you like me to call you? That opens the door to allowing for a discussion around name difference, possibly from charting, and that might help open up the possibility to other discussions that may flow from that. But I think your answer was far better than that general first initial approach. And I am aware that we are actually past time right now. So if we missed some questions, we will try to grab them and answer them and send them back out through email. I really want to thank everybody for being here today. You'll receive an email tomorrow that includes the PowerPoints, and hopefully the webinar will be recorded, and well, it is recorded and uploaded to the website with those resources available. Eli, I really want to thank you for all of the work that you put into this and really making this a smooth and very informative time together today. For people who requested certificates, you'll get them within about a week. And just to let people know, our next webinar is on February 13th, and we'll be talking about trans policy issues and how those issues impact victims who are transgender or gender nonconforming, and what providers need to know about that. So thank you very much for being here, everybody.
Thank you.